Hi, I'm Amber from Urban Timber Revival, and I'm often asked to slow it down and show more of the process when I make these mountains. So that's just what this video is. It's not the most exciting, but I did do an overhead cam and just kind of showed the process of how I made this. So follow along.
So my workspace is about a quarter of a garage, so I do a lot of my work outside. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm just ripping down some old fence boards I had, and then I get a backer, and I always do some horizontal lines across the top because I want the mountain peaks to be even. I don't know where they'll land, so I give myself some options. Then I draw a line down the middle, and I just start lining up the main mountain. So in addition to using reclaimed fencing, I also have a bucket of other wood I have on hand, and I'm always looking to add some depth to the piece of art. So I'm looking for some wood that might have a little height, a little higher than the fence I'm using. So that's kind of what I'm doing now. I'm just trying to see what will fit together. Am I having enough of a profile to give some depth to the piece? So now I am carefully laying the first mountain. You really want to get the angles on this perfect, because if it doesn't line up just so, then all of your other mountains will be off, and yeah, it just gets tricky. So I just use that speed square to help me. You see that at the top of the screen. So once I have these two pieces nailed down and I know they're correct, it's just a matter of filling that mountain with additional cuts. I cut the first top pieces a little shorter to get those peaks in, and then I work on the secondary mountains. Now this is a little bit trickier. You saw in the beginning how I drew several horizontal lines across the top. That's because I generally want my center peak a little higher, the side peaks a little lower. So, I can go to those secondary lines that I drew to make sure that each side is even. And I usually draw 3 to 4 lines because I just don't know where I'm going to land until I start building, and it gives me options. So basically I'm just repeating the process of the center mountain on the sides. This time I'm doing a little different process. I'm putting down the peaks first and then kind of painting them, and then I go back and add the middle. And in past days I would usually probably paint the peaks and the sides before I even start building, so they're already done, but I just thought I'd try a different process today. And I do fill the holes on the white parts from any nails, just so it looks nice when it's finished. On the reclaimed wood, I just don't. I just leave the holes how they are. So generally I will fill these and let them dry for about an hour, and then come back and I will sand them down and then give them a good paint job. So this is probably the slowest, tedious part of the process. If you have any questions about what I've done so far, just drop a note in comments and I will answer them. I usually check these comments several times a week and make sure I answer everything. If you're curious about the angles on these ones are at 45 degrees. They don't have to be. I just recommend once you pick an angle, stick with it, or the math can get tricky. The 45 degrees is just pretty simple, and then you can use your speed squares to line everything up. All right, so I'm going to paint this, and I just will let these peaks dry, and then I will fill them in. So while I'm doing this, I'm going to talk about paint a little bit. If you're using white paint on cedar especially, you have to really be concerned about the tannins lifting. So I always make sure I use a paint that has like a stain blocker in it or a primer built into it, so that the tannins don't eventually lift. That was one thing I learned early on, is I would hang the first few pieces I did for myself for my home and notice things were starting to brown. And yeah, you have to watch the tannins in the wood. So just make sure you use, you could even do kills ahead of time, that kills primer, and then paint over it. That would work just fine too. Another question I always get is, what type of nail gun am I using? For this one I'm using cedar. It's pretty thick, so I am going to use my brad nailer. It does leave larger holes. If I'm using finer or thinner wood, I will move down to a pin nailer. And some people I know don't use nails at all. They just use heavy glue. I use glue and nails, but it's up to you. You can see what works. I just don't like the art shifting as I'm working, so I like the security of the nails and the glue. I've also found if I don't use both when I'm trimming the piece, you can have some pieces, they just don't have enough hold and they might fly off, and yeah, that's always a bummer. But for smaller pieces, or if you have time to let things sit, I think that just wood glue would be fine. So some of these smaller pieces, you're gonna have to get out your saw and cut some skinny pieces along the way. I just keep all my equipment out and just work as I go. Another question I get by people who make these is what happens if a nail comes through the back of the piece? And that will occasionally happen, especially if you're using different depths and you forget to change your nails. At the very end, what I do is I just flip the piece over, and if anything shot through the back, I just grind it off with my grinder. Another question I get is what type of backer am I using? So honestly, I use a lot of reclaimed material, so I will use almost anything. Right here I'm using OSB. It's about a 1/2 inch thick. And the reason I like OSB is that it does not warp to the extent that a general piece of plywood will warp. The bigger the piece, the more chance that general plywood will warp on you. So OSB is always safe to make sure that it's flat. All right, so I'm going to work on the sky here. And when I'm working with colors that aren't white, I don't worry about the tannins at all. I don't prime. So today I'm using paint. I often use stain as well. Just kind of depends what materials I have on site. And speaking of materials, you can put a shout out on your Facebook page, your neighborhood page, and just ask for paint samples. You'll be surprised how many cool samples you get. This is not paint I bought. Well, I bought it the second time, but first I got it as a sample, and this color combo sold so well that I got a big gallon of it, and now I use it a lot. But it's a good way to experiment. So when I'm doing my skies, you might see some gaps here at the end, but I don't worry about them. You know, I could go trim some pieces and cover those fine gaps, but I like to have a lot of depth and dimension to my pieces, so I will just do a general flat lay first, cover as much as I can, and then I come over the top with additional layers that will fill some of those tiny gaps I have left. So another question I get is, what is the weight of these pieces? Well, they can be pretty heavy. They can be like 9 to 15 pounds depending how big they are. So you want to be very careful what you're hanging these with for safety purposes. I always get on Amazon and I order what's called a French cleat. I'll add the link to my Amazon store below. It is an affiliate link, I have to disclose that. So what a French cleat is it's just like a bar is the easiest way to describe it. So you put one piece on the back of your artwork, and then you hang one on the wall, and then it just slides right on the wall. I don't know, I'm not explaining that very well, but you can look at French cleat and see the installation. It just ensures that you're getting into the studs and it's safe, especially if you're hanging these overhead of a bed or something. You just don't want anyone to get hurt. And just kind of a fun fact on this one, you can see on the reclaimed wood part how I have variations of the wood. This is all from the same fence, but if you use the front of the fence on one side and then flip it and use the back of the fence, just think of that fence out in nature. You know, some of it's getting sun, some of it's getting shade. So if you just kind of flip the pieces back and forth as you're working, you'll get that cool variation. Okay, I'm nearing the end of the sky, so it's time to glue everything down. And wood glue, what type of wood glue do I use? I'm not picky, honestly. I buy by the gallon, so it's more affordable, and I just buy what the best price is. The only time I'm picky is around Christmas time. If I'm doing like Christmas trees that might be outdoors or something, I do look for a glue that's exterior rated, but I use them all. I use the Type Bond, I use the Gorilla, yeah, probably any glue you can think of, I've used it. Honestly, I can't tell the difference. I'm not that picky. So typically when I build these, I will let the glue sit for at least an hour before I attempt to trim it, just to make sure it has a good bond. You just don't really want anything breaking off when you go to trim after doing all of this work. All right, so you can see this is nearly complete, and then I will start doing the second layer on the sky just to give it some dimension, and you'll see at the end what I mean by that. And then back to the glue, you can see I have my glue in a weird tube. I know there's special glue tubes you can buy, but they always get clogged up after a time. It's just really frustrating. So what I do is I go on bulk on Amazon and I buy, I think they're like ketchup dispensers like you would use in a restaurant, and I just fill them until it gets gobby and I just pull out another one. They just seem to lasts me a lot longer than the standard glue bottles that you get. Now you can see on the top, this is thinner wood, so I have moved from a brad nailer to a pin nailer. And I usually use DeWalt products, but I have to say that I was going through pin nailers a couple times a year, and someone recommended this cheap one over at Harbor Freight. It was only like $25, and I absolutely love it. It leaves hardly any marks at all. I haven't had any issues with it. I love the way the pins load, so a little free plug to Harbor Freight for their inexpensive pin nailer. All right, so you can see how I'm building these layers. I just think it gives it more interest, and it kind of, I don't know, like rays coming off the mountains possibly. I just like the way it looks, and here's a close-up picture. Okay, it's time to trim this. I just put a jig on my table saw. You can see it here. If you go look at my other videos, I show you how to make that simple jig, and I really need a bigger table saw. I need a bigger base. This is a little tricky to get this through, but it's going to do the job. All right, and I just flip that over. Now, a lot of times with a piece this big, I would probably just flip it on my table and cut it with a circular saw, but this did the trick for today. So at this point, I touch up the piece. I like to touch up before I put the frame on, just to ensure I don't get any paint on the frame. I also seal it with polyacrylic spray. I like the matte kind, and I usually do 2 coats of that. So unfortunately, I thought I filmed myself framing, but the camera wasn't on. But I just took some natural wood and I put a frame around it. Just adds another layer of color to the piece. Now, I could have used the silver reclaimed as well. That would have looked nice, but this is what I chose for this one. And just a little close-up of the layers. You can see that depth, and it's all done.
All right, so that was a little more of the snippets of what it takes to build a mountain. This was just a very basic one I think anyone could tackle, and I hope you enjoyed the video.